The commander who defied orders to save an alien, and never regretted it. Commander Jackson Reed had spent 23 years following orders without question. 23 years of military precision, unwavering discipline, and absolute loyalty to the chain of command. But all of that ended on a frozen Tuesday in March, when he chose to throw his career away for a pair of luminous amber eyes that held more humanity than most humans he'd ever known. The distress beacon had been pinging for 3 hours before Central Command finally acknowledged it. Reed stood in the command center of Forward Base Arcturus, watching the signal pulse on his screen like a dying heartbeat. The source was 15 kilometers north, in the middle of the worst blizzard the sector had seen in decades. "Sir, Command has issued a directive," Lieutenant Morrison said, his voice tight with the kind of tension that came from delivering news he knew his commander wouldn't like. "We're to ignore the signal. Intelligence suggests it's from a Veloran scout ship." Reed's jaw tightened. The Velorans, humanity's greatest enemy in a war that had dragged on for 7 bitter years. A war built on misunderstanding, fear, and the kind of political maneuvering that turned neighbors into adversaries and allies into corpses. "Someone's alive out there," Reed said quietly, his eyes never leaving the pulsing beacon. "Yes, sir, but orders are orders. Command believes it's a trap. They want us to maintain position and wait for the storm to pass before conducting reconnaissance." Reed knew what that meant. By the time the storm cleared, whoever was out there would be dead. The temperature had already dropped to -40, and the wind chill made it feel like -60. Nothing survived long in conditions like that, human or alien. "Prep a hover sled," Reed said. "Full cold weather gear. I want emergency medical supplies and thermal blankets." Morrison's eyes widened. "Sir, Command explicitly. I heard what Command said, Lieutenant. I'm giving you a direct order. Prep the sled. Commander Reed, if you disobey this directive, they'll court-martial you. Your career will be over." Reed finally turned to look at his second-in-command, and Morrison took an involuntary step back at the intensity in his commander's eyes. "Then I guess I'll have plenty of time to sleep at night, won't I? Because I sure as hell won't be able to sleep knowing I let someone die in a frozen wasteland because a bunch of politicians playing soldier decided an enemy's life wasn't worth saving." 20 minutes later, Reed was alone on the hover sled, racing through a wall of white that tried to tear him from his seat with every gust. The beacon led him north, through ice fields and frozen valleys that looked like the surface of some dead moon. His hands ached inside his thermal gloves, and his face felt like someone was holding a blowtorch to it, despite the advanced cold weather gear. He found the crash site in a shallow ravine, the Veloran scout ship crumpled against an ice shelf like a child's discarded toy. The hull was breached in 3 places, and snow had already begun to pile inside. Reed killed the sled's engine and approached on foot, his weapon drawn more from habit than hostility. The distress beacon was louder now, screaming its digital SOS into the uncaring storm. Reed climbed through the largest breach and found himself in what remained of the ship's command deck. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting everything in a sickly red glow. That's when he saw her. She was pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, her body twisted at an angle that made Reed's stomach lurch. But it was her skin that stopped him cold, a deep, vibrant orange that seemed to glow even in the dim light, like a sunset made flesh. Her hair, impossibly, was a cascade of golden blonde that fanned out around her head like a halo. One arm reached toward the beacon's control panel, fingers stretched as if she'd been trying to shut it off before she'd lost consciousness. Reed had seen plenty of Velorans before, mostly through rifle scopes or on propaganda posters, but he'd never seen one up close. Never noticed how remarkably humanoid they were, how their features held the same capacity for pain and fear that he saw in the mirror every morning. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, those luminous amber irises focusing on him with obvious difficulty. She said something in her own language, a melodic string of syllables that held the unmistakable tone of a question. "I'm here to help," Reed said, knowing she probably couldn't understand him. He holstered his weapon and knelt beside her, assessing the situation. The beam was heavy, reinforced titanium by the look of it. He'd need leverage to lift it. The Veloran woman said something else, more urgent this time, and tried to move. She cried out, a sound of pure agony that transcended language barriers. "Easy," Reed said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was ice cold through her torn uniform. "Don't move, I'm going to get you out." It took him 15 minutes to rig a hydraulic jack from his emergency supplies and position it under the beam. All the while, he talked to her, a steady stream of reassurance and explanation even though he knew she couldn't understand the words. But tone was universal, and he watched her eyes track his movements, saw the way she relaxed fractionally when he spoke in calm, measured tones. When he finally lifted the beam enough for her to pull free, she screamed again, and Reed saw why. Her left leg was badly broken, the bone visible through torn orange skin and the shredded fabric of her uniform. Blood deep purple, almost black, pooled beneath her. "Okay," Reed muttered, mostly to himself. "Okay, we can work with this." He'd done field medicine in a dozen war zones across 3 planets. He could stabilize a compound fracture in his sleep. But his hands shook as he cut away her uniform and began to work, and it had nothing to do with the cold. She watched him the entire time, those amber eyes never leaving his face. When he had to manipulate the bone back into position, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his sleeve. But she didn't scream. She just held on, breathing through the pain in sharp, measured gasps, and Reed found himself whispering apologies in a voice he barely recognized as his own. He splinted the leg with materials from the wreckage, then wrapped her in every thermal blanket he had. She was shivering violently now, shock setting in on top of hypothermia. He needed to get her back to base, needed to get her warm and stable, needed his comm unit crackled to life. "Commander Reed, this is Central Command. We have detected unauthorized movement from your position. You are ordered to return to base immediately and explain your actions." Reed looked down at the Veloran woman in his arms. She was so light, even accounting for the lower gravity of the planet they were on. Delicate despite her alien nature, dying if he didn't move fast. "Negative, Command," he said into his comm. "I have recovered a survivor from the crash site, bringing her in for medical treatment." Static. Then, "Commander Reed, you will leave the hostile combatant and return to base. That is a direct order from General Hawthorne himself." Reed reached up and switched off his comm unit. The journey back was a nightmare. The storm had intensified, and the sled's navigation system kept glitching in the electromagnetic interference. Reed drove with one hand and kept the other on the Veloran woman, monitoring her pulse, checking her breathing, making sure the thermal blankets stayed in place. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling in her own language. Once she opened her eyes and looked directly at him, and Reed could have sworn he saw something like gratitude there, or maybe recognition. The acknowledgement that passed between two beings who understood on some fundamental level that compassion didn't have a species requirement. The base appeared through the white like a mirage, its lights barely visible through the driving snow. Reed expected resistance when he arrived, expected Morrison to be standing at the gate with a security team and restraints, expected the end of everything he'd built over 2 decades of service. Instead, Morrison met him at the medical bay doors with a gurney and 2 medics who didn't ask questions. They took the Veloran woman from his arms with professional efficiency, whisking her away to surgery while Reed stood in the hallway, dripping melted snow and watching his career circle the drain. "Morrison," he said quietly, "I need you to understand. With respect, sir, I don't need to understand anything." The lieutenant's face was unreadable. "I'm following the orders of my commanding officer." "You told me to prep the sled. I prepped the sled. You went on a rescue mission. These medics are treating a survivor. That's all that's happening here as far as I'm concerned." Reed felt something tighten in his chest. "You'll be implicated. They'll come after you too." Morrison shrugged. "Probably, but I've been keeping a log of every order that came through from command tonight, including the one that told us to let someone die without even confirming whether they were a combatant or a threat. I figure if they want to court-martial us for having a conscience, we'll have plenty of material for a very interesting defense." 6 hours later, Reed sat in a holding cell waiting for the hammer to fall. The Veloran woman, her name was Calith, he'd learned from the translated medical files, was stable. The surgery had been successful. She would live, would walk again, would go home to whatever family waited for her on whatever world the Velorans called their own. And Reed would spend the rest of his life knowing that he'd made the right choice. The door to his cell opened, and General Hawthorne walked in, his face carved from granite and disapproval. Reed stood at attention, even though he was pretty sure military courtesy was a moot point at this stage. "Sit down, Commander," Hawthorne said, his voice tired. Reed sat. The general pulled up a chair and sat across from him, studying Reed's face like he was trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. "You know what you've done?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea the political shitstorm you've created, the diplomatic nightmare, the precedent you've set?" "Yes, sir." Hawthorne leaned back, and for the first time Reed saw something other than anger in the old man's eyes. "Tell me why." Reed thought about the easy answers: duty, honor, the sanctity of life. But those were words politicians used to justify their decisions. They weren't the truth. "Because I looked into her eyes, sir, and I saw someone's daughter. Someone's friend, maybe someone's mother. I saw a person who was terrified and in pain and alone, and I couldn't just leave her there, orders or no orders, career or no career. I couldn't do it." Silence filled the cell. Then Hawthorne sighed, a sound like air escaping from a deflating balloon. "The Velorans have been in communication," he said quietly. "Calith was a junior diplomatic officer. She was on an unauthorized mission to try to establish back-channel peace talks. Her ship malfunctioned in the storm. When her government realized she was missing, they sent a formal inquiry." He paused. "You saved their best hope for ending this war, Reed." Reed's breath caught. "They're calling for a ceasefire, want to negotiate in good faith, using Calith's survival as proof that not all humans are the monsters their propaganda makes us out to be. Politicians are scrambling to figure out how to spin this into a victory." And my court-martial. Hawthorne's smile was grim. Delayed indefinitely. Turns out it's hard to prosecute a man for saving the life that might end a 7-year war, though you've made enemies in some very high places. Reed nodded slowly. I can live with that, sir. I know you can, son. The general stood. That's what scares the hell out of them. 3 months later, Reed stood in the observation gallery of the newly christened peace station, watching delegates from both sides work out the details of a treaty that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Caliph was down there, walking with only the slightest limp, her orange skin and blonde hair marking her as the symbol of everything this peace represented. She looked up as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met across the distance. She pressed her hand to the glass, and Reed did the same. No, he thought. He had never regretted it, not for a single second, and he never would.